Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our friend Susan K. Williams Smith. Susan is a pastor, author, and musician interested in the relationships between politics, religion, and race. She's interested in spiritual community where the needs of people are met and where they are encouraged to become engaged in changing systems and policies which have caused their spiritual, economic, and social oppression. She's a graduate of Occidental College and Yale Divinity School. While a pastor, she worked with inner city kids in an arts camp, teaching them music, dance, acting, and drawing. Susan's books include The Book of Jeremiah, The Life and Ministry of Jeremiah A. Wright, Jr., With Liberty and Justice for Some, The Bible, the Constitution, and Racism in America, and also Crazy Faith, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives. You can learn more about Susan and all of her work at candidobservation.com. So Susan, so great to see you again. Congratulations on all your work, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's always great to talk with you. I love, the work that you've done in our conversations, and, really glad that we're able to talk about kind of a different, aspect of things with Find Your Next Calling. But first, is there anything I left out that you want people to know about you?
No, it's good. You hit all the nails on the head, so I'm good.
Why don't you tell people where you live?
I live in Columbus, Ohio, where it is not snowing, by the way. I asked Brian before we got on air if it was still snowing in New Jersey. He said, they might
Yes.
get snow, but we don't have any snow. It's looking gray. It's going to rain, but no snow. We're good.
Hey. So before we get into talking about, a next calling, let's talk about some of your books. Could you go through each of them and just kind of explain to folks what each of them is about?
Um, yeah, my very first book that I got published was a children's book, Carla and Annie, which I'm really trying to read right now, really make it a children's book to how do it's about a little black girl who was told by her little white friend that she was black, plain old, ugly black by the little white girl's mom. And so that's just and that happened to me. It's actually autobiographical. So I'm trying to write it in a way that'll put the idea forward of how that affects little black kids, yada, yada, yada. So I'm trying to do that. Then I wrote From Calvary to Victory, which was a series of Lenten devotions, actually, to get people to concentrate on some of the things that we as Christians need to concentrate on. And then I wrote uh, uh, Crazy Faith, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives, which is one of my favorite. It's about the things that, what faith looks like and why you really can't call it crazy because you do things that nobody else thinks you can do or that should be done. And then I don't remember all of them. I wrote the Book of Jeremiah, which is the life and ministry of Jeremiah Wright. His ministry is one of the most powerful I've ever encountered. And I was just so angry during the 2008 election, but his name, his ministry was sullied by, the way a soundbite was taken out of context. I hated that. So I decided I was going to write a book to talk about what the ministry was. And then I wrote, I don't know, I'm getting them all mixed up, but then with Liberty and Justice for Some, which is about how the Bible, the Constitution, and the Constitution have worked in conjunction with each other to help proliferate and to propagate racism in this country. And now I'm thinking about going one step further and talking about the Bible, the Constitution, and the media, and continuing to support racial uh, enmity in this country because the media has been just despicable. But people go after headlines and money and profit, and so that's what happened. So that's pretty much. I think I got all of them. I think
Well, the one the most familiar with is with Liberty and Justice for Some. And for those of you who follow the How to Heal Our Divides blog, you know that I've taken several excerpts from that book, and use them as blog articles to, help get the word out about Susan's work because I just thought that, was such an important topic and so many good points out of that book. Can you share with folks how that book came about?
Yeah, I love to tell that story because I was reading. I like to just read history in general, and I like to read the history of religion and racism and all that kind of stuff. And I was reading this guy, Sam Bowers, who was the Grand Wizard of the KKK. Um, it describes how he had a religious experience. It was his Damascus Road experience. That's what he said. And he said God kind of knocked him off his horse and told him that he was to save white people. I thought, wow, that's weird. And so he went on this thing. He was doing the work of God, and he was training people to, hate black people, women, Catholics, because that's what God told him to do.
Hmm.
And what bothered me most about it was that he was a devout Christian. So the word Christian now just aggravates my soul. But he was a devout Christian. So he went to church every Sunday. He was probably an officer, and I thought, but in between church services, he was training people, white men primarily, to beat and to kill black people. And he would have them in Bible studies, and he would have them fast before they went out on one of their lynching
Hmm.
expeditions. And then what really got me, I didn't see this written, but it's true that he could have gone to a lynching on a Saturday night and shown up for church the
Yeah.
next morning in
Yeah.
a suit and even help serve communion. And you know what? That just ticked me all the way off. So that's why I got started in doing that.
Hmm.
It still bothers me when I think about it. And so many people now are like the same way. But what I concluded in with liberty is that it has to be two gods, because the God that sanctions bigotry of any kind against women, against black people, against brown people, Islamophobia, the LGBTQ, that's not the God that is described in the Bible, or the Bible, or the God that was taught to me by my Sunday school teachers. And so, there's two different guys. And you can't say, if you have a group of people who say they're Christian and they try to follow all the things that Jesus said to do, which are not fun to do, by the way, everybody knows that. And you have another group of people who call themselves Christian, but the only time they mention Jesus is at Christmas and Easter. But other than that, they're in their own little world, and they're forming their own policies and stuff. And they call it religion, but it's not religion. It's ideology. That's two different gods, and they do not intersect. So
Well, is
that's
it
why
two gods or is it God and Satan? I mean,
I'm trying to be nice. I'm trying to be nice. But I think that the myth that we live in myths, and so many of us need to believe in the myth of like American
yeah.
exceptionalism, or myth of Christianity, or the myth of democracy. It soothes our souls. So now, even though the threat of authoritarianism is right in front of us, many people are still living in the myth that we are an exceptional country, and the myth that nothing bad, as has happened in Europe and in other countries, could ever happen here. So they're not thinking it through, and they're not thinking it through that, like Russia or some of our other enemies have nuclear weapons, and they could take us out like that. They could take us out, and people are not thinking about that. They think that we are immune and that we are so great and so powerful that that's a myth. That's a myth. And to think that many people, think that their God, would even ordain that God would be displeased with democracy, that God would be displeased that, some policies are being put in place to help all of the people and not just a small group of people, that God would not like that. Brian, it just boggles my mind. It just boggles my mind. So what I come to understand is that there is Christianity, which is a certain set of beliefs. Doesn't tell you what to believe. Somebody made a point in one of the books I read. Dude, Jesus never tells you what to believe. Jesus tells you how to live. He doesn't have all these rules like the Pharisees had, that, what,
Yeah.
614
Yeah.
rules. He doesn't have all that. Just how are you supposed to live? And you have to live in communication and in community with other people. What the other folks are practicing is a complete disavowal of that. And so it just gives me the creeps. And so I keep poking my head into it and looking into it more.
Well, I mean, the Ku Klux Klan may not be as strong as it used to be, but the whole white Christian nationalism certainly
Yeah,
is.
right.
It's just hard to believe how distorted, Christianity, at least that flavor of Christianity has become.
And the thing is that it's been like that for such a long time. I just finished reading Rachel Maddow's book, Prequel or Prequel,
Hmm.
and she talks about in the 1930s, when we were on the verge of going into World War II. There's always been extremely large contingent of people in this country who have not liked democracy. And so the fact that we might be going into the war, they didn't like that. And there's this guy, Father Coughlin, who's a priest, had this huge, following of people, and he pushed fascism. He pushed all that. You have Henry Ford, who was so much he was a respected anti-Semite, meaning that the Germans, Hitler himself, respected Henry Ford's racism so deeply that it said that in his office he had a framed picture of Henry Ford that hung behind his. What are we talking about? So
Wow.
the myth of American exceptionalism has been with us for a very, very long time, but we don't know that. We don't read the history, so we don't know that. So what that can do is make you now feel like a sense of panic. Oh, is this never happened again? It has happened, and people have stepped up to fight it. The difference between then and now is that you have the huge millions of people who want the former president, regardless of what he's done. But the key thing is that he was the former president, and that has given him some leeway, I think, that maybe other people might not have had. And he doesn't have the decency or the respect enough for the office of the presidency or the state of this country to just sit down, right? And he does, and he's too arrogant to think that, he needs to ask for a pardon. He doesn't want to be pardoned. He wants to be in office again, and he wants to destroy the country. But people living in the myth of American exceptionalism think, it won't be so bad. In spite of the fact he's not even making any sense. He talks about cognitive impairment, but
Yeah.
he doesn't make any sense. He acts like a middle school kid. I remember the guys in my middle school class acting like he acts, and people are just loving him. So that's what makes it a little bit different. The fact that he was a president, and that he has stacked the courts in his favor, the Supreme Court in his favor, and so it makes it a little hairy. But at this moment, I would have to just call on crazy faith and believe that there are enough people who are opening their eyes finally and seeing and starting to push back and have made determinations, even if they won't say it out loud, that they're not going to vote for him. That's the only thing, that's the only thing that keeps me sane.
Well, all of the recent elections, have shown that trend, so I'm hopeful for November. And maybe if we can get past that, we can ultimately we'll never be done with this, but hopefully it'll decrease in significance.
Well, I don't know that it'll decrease, but because it's been a part of the American fabric for so long, but perhaps this whole experience will um, will will sensitize people to the fact of it's like a worm, that whole bigotry, that whole racist, that whole white supremacist thought and practice system. It's a worm in our government, in our country, and it's always been there. So hopefully this will make people stop and think, and make more people want to stop and think and study. Some people are never going to stop and think and study, but the key is that people have to read and people have to know what's going on. So number one, they don't get really so bent out of shape with this that they just give up hope, because that's what fascists want you to do, stop hoping. But then two, do actions that are knowledge-based, knowledge-based. They're not acting on pure emotion, but they're acting on something that, this is what happened, this is what was done, this is what we need to do. And people, I think, need to read this thing called Project 2025. It lays out what the conservative plan is
Yes.
for taking over the country.
Yeah.
People sit down and read it. Get yourself a glass of something or a cup of something and sit down and read it to know what you're dealing with. Because again, if you don't know what you're dealing with, you do stay in the myth. It's
Yeah.
the myth.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about finding a new calling. From a career perspective, you had a long and successful career as a pastor, and then decided to go off on your own and start some new things. So have you reflected on that process, how you went about it, and why?
Well, I started on a new path because some devastating things happened in my life, and so it was almost, I was forcing myself to do something so that I would remain connected to what I know my call to be. I know I'm called, to be working in the area of ministry. What it looks like has changed. And I clearly believe, so I have this thing called Crazy Faith Ministries, and it's very small, and I work it, but I work it to strengthen me, if that makes any sense, to strengthen my spirit, which was just so whittled down by the things that happened in my life. And so I worked it. And you know what? After 10 years of doing this, I'm finally beginning to find my stride. I'm finally beginning to breathe again and to open my eyes and see and ask God. Okay, so what do you really want me to do? Because I have the skills. You're right. I was a journalist. I love being a journalist, and I'm a writer. And inside of me, I keep feeling like what I need to do for as many days as I have left on this earth is to really work that gift of writing. And I think that there are things, I'm not a scholar. And I say that, I mean, I study a lot, but I'm not a scholar. And the reason I said that is because scholars use like the really, most of them use that really technical scholar-like language, and nobody can understand what they're saying. So it's that I can write in the ways that people think. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
And give people something that's factual. It's factual and enough, hopefully enough information that will make them curious and want to know more. That's my goal. I want people to know stuff. So I do the nonprofit stuff. That is, a change in the career that I had as a pastor. This is pastoring in a different way, but now I'm really looking forward to and pushing myself to push the writing more, so that before I leave this earth, I can have written a couple of more books at least that talk about where we are and where God is and how we put all this together and, that kind of stuff. I dislike loftiness, Brian. I dislike lofty theology. What is that? I mean, I dislike
I'm the
that.
same way.
It doesn't, what does that do? I mean, how does that help you? It doesn't,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
you, I think that theology, yeah, you have to have, it's good that people study the theologians and all that. But at the end of the day, the people who need the theology to help are the people who sit in the pews, the people who don't know a thing about Bart or Tillich or James Cone, and they don't care. What they need to know is, who is God? Where is God? When I don't find God, where is God? That kind of stuff. And my prayer is that I can help do that through my writing and give people eyesight to see what the powers and principalities are that are talked about in the Bible. You can say powers and principalities, but if people don't know what you're talking about, right? Then it's like it's a phrase that goes over people's heads. So that's what I'm glad that the things that happened to me in my life, one day I'll tell you about, not today, but one day, but the things that happened to me were a good thing.
Hmm.
They were a good thing, because I think what happened to me is I was in a pastorate in a church, and I was tired. I was so tired. I was so burned out. But I was never going to leave, because why? Because it was stable. It was a
Hmm.
stable job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Job is different than calling, right? It's just different. Um, and so when I went through all of that, and I went to counseling therapy, which I think everybody who's in ministry should go to therapy. You should have therapy like you have, communion every month. But when I went through all of that, the one thing that the chief or the head psychologist said to me, she says, "You have everything you need for ministry. Everything you have, it's in you." And she said, "What I think is that God had to snatch you up out of there."
Hmm.
I will never forget that. I may make that the title of one of my books before I get more into the weeds of the stuff. But I think there probably are a lot of people. You know why? Because we are shaped and influenced by what we have seen ministry be. Pastor, many people, most people who are going to seminary think they have to be pastors, but ministry is so wide open. It's
Absolutely.
so wide open, and we don't think about it. So I can be in ministry as a writer. I can be in ministry as a writer of historical fiction, or even as a novelist, or a playwright. That's still ministry. Why? Because we're trying to connect God to the people. And
Sure.
that's what it's about. So
Sure.
people are pastors who should not be pastors. That's like many people are singers who should not sing. Maybe we should, run the board, but many people who are singers should not be. And I think again, that's that myth. That's the myth. And so if for me, if I'm able to take myself out of the 20th century model, the 19th and 20th century model of ministry, and evolve and show others through my own work how to evolve in the 21st century and how to get people to lean toward God in a time when many people are leaning away from God, precisely because the 19th and 20th century models of ministry have turned so many people off. If I can do that, then I think then that's an extension of my calling. And maybe God was waiting for me to do that for a long time. And maybe that's, why some of the things have happened to me in my life that have.
I mean, I totally agree that there's a need for different forms of ministry than what, we only traditionally had, a specific model for so many decades and generations.
Yeah, and people hated to go to church. So many people were so glad for COVID, right? So many people go to church all the time. COVID came and they could do this, worship online. They are so glad. They didn't want to do that. They didn't like being, in the church. They didn't like it and they weren't getting anything out of it. So now people have choices. They can listen to who they
Yeah,
want to listen to, and they can be fed in all these different ways. You get the
yeah,
broccoli here and the peas and carrots. You got all these different ways of being fed. And then you are equipped. You are fed spiritually in order to be able to go out and do ministry in broader ways. And I actually like that. I think that is a gift of COVID.
So let's talk a little bit about discernment, if we could. In your experience, have you found either processes or people or, reference books or what have you that have been helpful for you in terms of deciding what to do?
I think I rely on the still small voice. I really do have those times, and I said, oh shoot, that's God talking to me. And you don't want to hear it. It's God talking. I don't get it from books. I really don't. I get it from um when I was going through my thing 10 years ago. I just shared with a group of people that my prayer was, come on, God. That was it. I didn't have any long prayers. I didn't do anything. Just come on, God. I would say that 100,000 times a day. It seemed like come on, God, come on, God, come on, God. Um, and I promise you, I felt nudges. I felt nudges, and I felt like it was like, but I felt like I had been like glued to a wall, like plastered against a wall of tradition or something. And it was like when I would say, "Come on, God," it was like I could almost feel God trying to pull me off and pull. And so in that period of time, my spirit was down, and I couldn't really, I don't know. It's like you can see, but you don't see. I go back to Alice Walker and she talks about the color purple, and God gets pissed off and he sees the color purple and you don't recognize it. I couldn't see. I really couldn't see the fullness of God's holiness. I can't see it all now, but I can see it a lot better. But as God pulled me away from those walls of tradition that I had been glued to, it was like slowly my eyesight began to get better, my spiritual eyesight and my spiritual hearing, because my eyes began to open wider. And so I was able to see the things, Brian, that I was holding on to that were keeping me plastered to the wall. And I was able to understand that I didn't have to be afraid to let go of them, right? I would say, come on, God. And God would say, it was like God would say, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to tell you something. And so I would try, and the more I would hear that, the more I would, you breathe differently and you just begin to move in a different way. And that's what happened with me. But then the other part of that is that once, for me, as I began to be pulled away from where I was, when I would read different things, I would see God, and
Mm,
and I
mm.
would just see it. So, oh, that's what you're trying to tell me. It's like when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Whew, that's what I would have to stop. Say, oh my gosh, because it would be that clear. Things that I may have read 1,000 times. All of a sudden, on the 1,001st time, I saw it in the way that God wanted me to see it. And it's truly liberating. So the discernment, I think, comes to different people in different ways. And I think we have to observe that and we have to honor that. But for me, it's like being pulled off of the wall that I've been glued to.
Mm, wow. So you've been a solopreneur, for a few years now. What kind of advice do you have for other people to consider to do the same?
I think that I'm a I think that people need to be still and to lean forward to be able to discern what God is saying. Because God might, for me, because I'm so completely an introvert, so completely. So, being a solopreneur in one way has been good, but we were built to be in community. And so I think that people, as people are going forward, if they lean toward being soloist, just by themselves, that they need to leave room open to hear God show them, direct them, and how to be in community with others, because you're never going to grow if you're just by yourself. You're never going to grow. You personally inside, you're never going to grow. It's like as I began to come off of that wall, I began to see things on television that I never saw, but so if I see things on television and it shows me on a documentary or something that I never would have watched before
Mm.
because I was too tired and too burned out, but I see things. Now, you know what that does? It makes me curious about other things. And then I seek out people to talk to, about different things that now I've learned. So it becomes like a self-moving, ball of growth. So I
Mm.
think that but if you are feeling like going on your own, of course, to sit down and compute on how you're going to live, you have to figure that out, because God is good and all, but everybody needs a job. Amen. You cannot live on, God's not going to give you the money. He's not going to, so you have to be realistic, but also know that as you are now really discerning God and feeling God and reaching for God in new ways, that God will lead you to places, and then God will kind of nudge you and say, this is what you're going to have to do in order to survive and to thrive while you're doing this part of the work, your life's work that I called you to do in the first place.
Amen. Amen. So kind of let's go back to your own entrepreneurial endeavors. What kinds of things do you have coming up? What are you focused on in terms of major projects next?
Well, now we're getting ready to launch. There's two things we're doing in 2024. We're going to concentrate on doing work with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women.
Mm.
One of the members of our board was incarcerated in a federal prison. And just to hear her stories, just makes you understand how we just forget. We just forget that group of people. What our ministry tries to do is go to the people that really are marginalized and left out. We go to them. Um, and so we're going to have a series of webinars featuring some women who have been incarcerated, and having some interviews with people who are in the incarceration business
Mm.
to
Mm.
talk about what's going on, to put, things in people's minds so that ministry can be extended. So, we were learning how, I didn't know this, but how if you're pregnant in a prison, they keep you in shackles while you're having a baby. What the heck is that about? How can you be in labor? Those types of things. Or in some prisons, there's no air conditioning in the summer, and it's stupid cold in the winter. But because we have an out of sight, out of mind mentality, we don't think about it. So our goal is to bring some of those things, specifically when it comes to women, what they're going through in prison, and what can we do in this world that says they love God? How can we help them? So that's our first
Mm.
major. The second major project is about um, gathering books, culturally relevant books, and distributing them, and forming like book reading sessions in communities, underserved communities, so that we can let the kids read books, hear books that feature kids like them. So that's the brown kids, that's the black kids, that's the Muslim kids. We need for our children to be included, and that, because what we're all done is we're all fed talk about indoctrination. We're fed the society's cultures, which is white culture. It's a nice culture, but it's not the only culture, right? It's not. And so we need for our children to see themselves so that they can imagine themselves and believe in themselves. So that's where we're in the process now of collecting books from different sources, culturally relevant books. And then the ongoing thing that we do, of course, is collecting socks for the homeless, because socks, you can't, on a day like today when it's raining, we have people walking around with wet socks. It just gives
Mm.
me the creeps just to think about it. People get trench foot. I mean, that's what they
Mm.
had in World War One. Just to think that people are suffering like that right next to us gives me the creeps. So that's what we're doing.
Wow. Wow. That's all phenomenal work. I know everyone I've ever talked to that's been involved in some type of prison ministry has just like really thought it was an amazing experience for them.
Yeah, and you think about how many, I read a statistic yesterday. I think the statistic was 80% of people in prison are in prison for non-violent offenses.
Hmm.
80%.
Wow.
80%. And I think that the number was also high for how many people have been in jail and have not had a trial.
Yeah, that's terrible.
It's
That's
awful.
just
It's
terrible.
it's it's awful. So we want to just kind of lift that up.
Good,
You know. So
good. Well, Susan, thank you so much for all of your work and, congratulations on all that you've done. I would encourage everyone again to check out Susan's website, candidobservation.com. And you can also find her on YouTube
yeah.
and other popular locations. So, Susan, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always an honor. And you keep on keeping on, Mr. Brian Elaine. I'm loving it. You're fighting that thing and you are getting a victory. So keep on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be back.
Thanks.